In the spring of 1897, workers broke ground on a construction project that would consume 2 million before a single guest ever walked through its doors. That's $75 million, today's currency. For a house. One house in rural New Jersey, built by a man whose wife happened to be a Vanderbilt. The estate would eventually span 1,200 acres. The mansion itself would contain 100 rooms. Architects would model it after an English manor house dating back to the 1500s. Italian stonemasons would carve details by hand. French craftsmen would install period woodwork. And when it was finished, when every chandelier hung, and every garden path was laid, the family would use it for perhaps 3 months each year. The rest of the time, an army of servants would maintain empty rooms, manicured lawns, and silent hallways, waiting for owners who were usually somewhere else. This wasn't unusual for the era. What made Florum different was the scale, the ambition, the sheer determination to create something that announced wealth so loudly that neighbors miles away would hear it. The Twombleys weren't the richest family in America, but they built like they were. And for a brief moment, at the turn of the century, they succeeded in creating a monument to excess that rivaled anything in Newport or the Berkshires. Then the world changed. The money didn't disappear overnight, but the relevance did. Within a generation, the estate became too expensive to maintain as a private residence, too large for any single family to occupy, too emblematic of an era that Americans were eager to forget. This is the story of Florum, a house built at the absolute peak of American industrial wealth. A mansion constructed with no expense spared and no practical considerations acknowledged. A monument that outlived its purpose almost as soon as construction crews packed up their tools and left. Understanding why anyone would build something this extravagant requires going back further than the groundbreaking. Back to the origins of the fortune that made it possible. Back to a family name that defined an entire era. Back to the moment when one man's shipping and railroad empire became the foundation for decades of conspicuous consumption by his descendants. Cornelius Vanderbilt died on January 4, 1877. He was 82 years old and worth approximately $105 million. That made him the wealthiest man in America. Richer than Rockefeller at that moment, richer than Carnegie. The fortune came from steamships first, then railroads. Vanderbilt had started with nothing, running a ferry between Staten Island and Manhattan as a teenager. By middle age, he controlled shipping routes up and down the East Coast. Then he pivoted to railroads, consolidating smaller lines into the New York Central Railroad, a transportation empire that connected New York City to the Great Lakes and beyond. When he died, that $105 million went almost entirely to one son. William Henry Vanderbilt inherited $90 million. The other children received comparatively modest bequests that still amounted to millions. But William got the empire. He doubled it within 8 years. By 1885, when he died, the fortune had grown to $200 million. William's approach to wealth differed from his father's. Cornelius had lived relatively modestly despite his riches. William embraced spending. He built a massive mansion on Fifth Avenue. He collected art. He understood that in the Gilded Age, displaying wealth was as important as accumulating it. His children learned that lesson well. William had 8 children who survived to adulthood. When he died, he split the fortune more evenly than his father had. Each child received substantial inheritances. Not equal shares, the sons got more. but enough that every Vanderbilt in the next generation could live without working. One of those children was Florence Adele Vanderbilt, born in 1854. She grew up in a world where money was never discussed, because it was never a concern. By the time she reached adulthood, the Vanderbilt name meant something specific in American society. It meant wealth, certainly, but also a particular kind of wealth. New money, earned through business rather than inherited from colonial aristocracy. The kind of fortune that required constant demonstration to be taken seriously by older families who viewed the Vanderbilts as upstarts. Florence married Hamilton McCown Twombly in 1877. The timing was perfect, just months after her grandfather's death and years before her father would pass. Twombly was 27 years old. Florence was 23. The match made sense on paper. Twombly came from a respectable New York family. His father had been a merchant. He himself worked in business, though with limited success. What he lacked in personal fortune, he gained through marriage. Florence's inheritance, combined with the Vanderbilt name, elevated Twombly into the highest circles of American society. The couple settled into the life expected of their class. They maintained a residence in New York City. They summered in Newport, Rhode Island, where the wealthy gathered each year in increasingly elaborate cottages that bore no resemblance to actual cottages. They had 4 children: Ruth, Florence, Hamilton, and Alice. By the 1890s, Twombly had largely abandoned any pretense of working. His wife's fortune made employment unnecessary. His role became managing that wealth and spending it in ways that maintained the family's social position. Other Vanderbilt descendants were building. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had constructed the Breakers in Newport, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palace that opened in 1895. Frederick Vanderbilt built a mansion in Hyde Park, New York. George Vanderbilt was completing Biltmore in North Carolina, the largest private residence in America with 178,926 square feet of floor space. The competition among cousins was implicit, but real. Each wanted to demonstrate that their branch of the family understood how to live at the scale the Vanderbilt fortune permitted. Hamilton and Florence Twombly looked at what their relatives were building and decided they wanted something comparable. Not in Newport, where everyone else was. Not in North Carolina, too remote. They wanted something close to New York, but distinct. New Jersey offered possibilities. The area around Madison and Morristown had attracted wealthy New Yorkers for decades. The landscape was beautiful. Rolling hills, mature trees, enough space for large estates. And the transportation connections were excellent. The Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western Railroad provided direct service to Manhattan. In 1890, Hamilton Twombly began purchasing land. Piece by piece, farm by farm, he assembled what would become one of the largest private estates in New Jersey. The property eventually encompassed 1,200 acres, nearly 2 square miles. All of it would be shaped to serve a single purpose, providing the setting for a house that would establish the Twomblys as equals to any family in America. By 1893, Twombly owned the land. Now he needed architects. The choice was obvious. McKim, Mead & White was the most prestigious architectural firm in America. They had designed buildings for Columbia University, the Boston Public Library, and Pennsylvania Station in New York. Their reputation rested on work that was both grand and refined. Classical proportions, impeccable details. Buildings that announced importance without shouting. Charles Follen McKim was the lead designer. He had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the training ground for architects who would shape America's Gilded Age. His partner, Stanford White, handled many of their most prominent residential commissions. Together, they represented everything Twombly wanted: credibility, taste, and the ability to execute at massive scale. The assignment was straightforward. Twombly wanted an English manor house, not an American interpretation, an actual recreation of the Tudor and Jacobean mansions that English aristocrats had built centuries earlier. He wanted brick and stone, not wood. He wanted rooms with high ceilings and massive fireplaces. He wanted a house that looked like it had stood for 300 years, even though it would be brand new. McKim and his team began studying English country houses. They visited estates, took measurements, sketched details. The model they ultimately chose was Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, built between 1607 and 1611 for Robert Cecil, the first Earl of Salisbury. Hatfield House embodied everything the Jacobean style represented: symmetry, red brick with stone accents, elaborate chimneys, a sense of permanence and aristocratic authority. It had been built by one of the most powerful men in England during the reign of James I. Now, it would be recreated in New Jersey by an American railroad heir's son-in-law. The plans took shape over months of revisions. The mansion would be enormous. The main house would stretch over 30,000 square feet. That didn't include the extensive service wings, the stables, the carriage houses, the greenhouses, the cottages for staff. The total built space across the estate would exceed 100,000 square feet. 100 rooms in the main house alone. Bedrooms for family and guests, drawing rooms, libraries, dining rooms, a ballroom, a billiard room. Servants' quarters separated by a maze of back staircases and hallways that allowed staff to move through the house invisibly. The entrance hall would rise 2 stories, lined with carved wood paneling. The Great Hall would feature a massive stone fireplace large enough to stand inside. Every room would receive period details: oak paneling, plaster ceilings with decorative moldings, leaded glass windows. Construction began in 1897. The timing reflected confidence. The American economy had recovered from the panic of 1893. The stock market was rising. Industrial production was expanding. For wealthy families, the late 1890s felt like a moment of triumph. The fortunes built after the Civil War had survived their first major test. Now was the time to celebrate. Twombly authorized whatever expenditures McKim recommended. Cost was secondary to quality. If Italian stonemasons produced better work than American craftsmen, hire Italians. If period woodwork needed to be sourced from Europe, buy it there. If the gardens required specific plantings available only from specialized nurseries, pay whatever they asked. The workforce assembled at the site numbered in the hundreds at peak construction. Laborers cleared land and dug foundations. Bricklayers built walls that rose 3 stories high. Carpenters installed floors and ceilings. Specialists arrived for particular tasks and then moved on. The brick came from local kilns, millions of them, each one laid by hand in Flemish bond pattern that created subtle texture across the facades. The stone trim required more care. Limestone had to be carved into window surrounds, door frames, quoins at the corners, and decorative elements that broke up the brick surfaces. Master stonemasons marked each piece before it left the workshop, ensuring everything would fit precisely when installed. The roof presented unique challenges. Tudor and Jacobean houses in England used slate, often lasting centuries without replacement. Twombly wanted the same longevity. Slate was imported, ton after ton of it, then cut to size and installed by roofers who specialized in historical techniques. The chimneys alone became architectural features. Traditional English manor houses used chimneys as decorative elements, twisting brick into elaborate patterns that served no structural purpose beyond demonstrating the mason's skill. Florham's chimneys followed that tradition. Each stack featured different brickwork patterns: spirals, diamonds, herringbone. From the ground, they appeared as sculpture against the sky. Inside, McKim's team installed woodwork that would have been impossible to source domestically. The entrance hall received oak paneling carved in the linen fold pattern popular in Tudor England. Each panel had to be individually fitted, working around the irregular plaster walls that European craftsmen had intentionally textured to avoid the flat uniformity of machine work. The Great Hall fireplace was constructed from limestone blocks, weighing hundreds of pounds each. The opening measured 8 feet wide and 6 feet tall. Logs the size of tree trunks could burn there. The mantel featured carved details that required months of specialized work. Above it, the Twombly family crest was carved into stone, as if they were English nobility rather than American plutocrats. Ceilings throughout the main rooms received decorative plasterwork, cornices, medallions, coffering. In the ballroom, the ceiling was divided into panels, each surrounded by molded plaster, creating geometric patterns that drew the eye upward. The windows presented another opportunity for period detail. Leaded glass was installed throughout, not for practical reasons, but because that's what a 17th-century English house would have featured. The small, diamond-shaped panes distorted views slightly, but created exactly the atmosphere Twombly wanted. Every chandelier was selected to match the period. Every door hinge was appropriate to the style. Every decorative element reinforced the illusion that this house had been transplanted whole from the English countryside. The work consumed 4 years. By 1901, the main house was complete enough for occupancy. The Twomblys moved in, though finishing work continued for months afterward. The final accounting showed that construction costs exceeded $2 million. That figure didn't include the land purchases, which had cost additional hundreds of thousands. It didn't include furnishings, which Twombly acquired separately. It was purely the cost of construction. For context, $2 million in 1901 would build you 500 average American houses. It was more than the annual municipal budget of most cities. It represented wealth on a scale that perhaps 50 families in the country could afford to deploy on a single residence. The estate was named Florum, a combination of Florence and Hamilton's names. The branding appeared everywhere, on gates, on carriages, on the livery worn by staff. The name announced ownership the way European aristocrats marked their properties. This was the Twombly estate. Everyone for miles around would know it. The finished estate required constant staffing. Maintaining 100 rooms, 1,200 acres of grounds, and the lifestyle the Twomblys expected demanded an organization that resembled a small corporation. The household staff alone numbered over 60 people. Inside the house, maids cleaned rooms that family members rarely entered. They dusted furniture, changed linens, polished silver, and maintained the appearance of perfection. Each room had to be ready for use at any moment, even if weeks or months passed between visits. The butler managed the household staff and oversaw formal service during meals. Footmen assisted during dinners and events. Housekeepers supervised cleaning operations. The kitchen staff included cooks, assistants, and scullery maids who handled the endless washing required after elaborate meals. Outside, groundskeepers maintained gardens that covered acres. The landscape design included formal gardens near the house, with geometric patterns created from precisely trimmed hedges and seasonal plantings. Further out, the property transitioned to pastoral landscapes. Meadows, specimen trees, winding paths that encouraged walking. Every view had been carefully composed. Nothing was left to chance or nature. The stables employed grooms and coachmen. Before automobiles became practical for daily use, the Twombleys relied on horse-drawn carriages for transportation around the estate and to the railroad station. Even after cars arrived, horses remained for recreational riding and farm operations. The estate included working farms that provided produce, dairy, and meat. Tenant farmers lived in cottages on the property, paying rent to the Twombleys while supplying the main house with fresh food. This arrangement was standard on large estates. It reduced operating costs while maintaining the illusion of self-sufficiency. Separate service buildings housed different operations. The laundry occupied its own structure, where staff handled the massive quantities of linens, clothing, and table settings the household generated. The greenhouses extended the growing season and provided flowers year-round for decorating the interior. The carriage houses sheltered vehicles and equipment. All of these functions happened out of sight from the main house. Service roads allowed deliveries and staff movement without disturbing the Twombleys or their guests. The family used Florum primarily as a spring and fall residence. They avoided the summer heat, preferring Newport. And winters were spent in New York City, where social obligations demanded their presence. But during those months when they occupied Florum, the estate operated at full capacity. Dinner parties brought dozens of guests from New York and surrounding estates. The dining room accommodated 40 people comfortably. Service was formal, multiple courses delivered by staff who had been trained in precise rituals of upper-class dining. The men would retire to the library or billiard room after meals while women gathered in the drawing rooms. These weren't casual family gatherings. They were performances of social status, repeated again and again throughout the season. Weekend guests stayed in bedrooms furnished with antiques and period details. Each room had its own character, its own color scheme, its own carefully selected art. Guests could wander the house and discover new spaces, each more elaborate than the last. The ballroom hosted events that drew the region's wealthy families. Musicians would play from a raised platform while couples danced beneath chandeliers. Florence Twombly, as hostess, ensured that every detail met the standards expected of a Vanderbilt. The guest lists reflected the Twombly's position. J.P. Morgan visited. Other Vanderbilt cousins came to see what Hamilton and Florence had built. Politicians, business leaders, European aristocrats traveling through America all received invitations to Florum. Being invited meant something. It confirmed your place in the highest circles of American society. But beneath the surface of these successful seasons, a fundamental problem existed. Florum was too large. The Twombleys had 4 children. Even with guests filling bedrooms, most of the house stood empty most of the time. The Great Hall, designed for gatherings of 100 people, hosted maybe a dozen major events each year. The rest of the time, staff dusted unused furniture and swept floors in rooms where nobody walked. The operating costs were staggering. Payroll for 60-plus employees. Maintenance and repairs on buildings covering 100,000 square feet. Heating costs during occupied months. Property taxes on 1,200 acres. Supplies for kitchens, stables, and farms. The annual expenses likely exceeded $500,000, equivalent to $15 million today. That money bought very little practical utility. it maintained an illusion. The illusion that the Twombleys were English aristocrats rather than the grandchildren of a Staten Island ferry operator. The illusion that this way of life was sustainable. The illusion that nothing would ever change. Hamilton Twombly understood finances well enough to know these costs couldn't continue forever. But stopping felt impossible. Selling would mean admitting the project had been a mistake. Scaling back would diminish the family's social position. So the spending continued, year after year, as long as the fortune held. Florence's Vanderbilt inheritance provided the foundation. Wise investments generated ongoing income. The money was sufficient, barely, to maintain everything. But only if nothing went wrong. Only if the economic conditions that created these fortunes remained stable. Only if the next generation cared about maintaining what their parents built. None of those assumptions would survive the coming decades. The first cracks appeared not in the buildings or the finances, but in the relevance of the lifestyle Florum represented. The Gilded Age was ending, even if the families who defined it didn't realize it yet. America was changing. The massive industrial fortunes built in the late 1800s had created a class of super-wealthy families who dominated society and politics. But that dominance was being challenged. Labor movements demanded better wages and working conditions. Progressive politicians pushed for regulation of monopolies and fairer taxation. Journalists exposed corruption and inequality. The public was growing tired of ostentatious displays of wealth while millions lived in poverty. Theodore Roosevelt's presidency, from 1901 to 1909, marked a shift. Roosevelt came from wealth himself, but he championed reforms that targeted the very monopolies that had built families like the Vanderbilts. His trust-busting campaigns broke up Standard Oil and other massive corporations. The message was clear. Accumulating unlimited wealth and power would no longer go unchallenged. World War I accelerated these changes. The war from 1914 to 1918 killed millions and disrupted the global economy. American men from all social classes served together. When they returned, many questioned why some families lived in 100-room mansions, while others struggled to afford basic housing. The patriotic unity of wartime created expectations for greater equality in peace. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified, establishing a federal income tax. For the first time, the government could systematically tax the wealthy. The initial rates were low, but they would climb dramatically, especially after World War I, when the government needed revenue to pay war debts. Wealthy families suddenly faced annual tax bills that previous generations never imagined. Estate taxes followed. When wealthy individuals died, the government could now claim a portion of inherited wealth. The very mechanism that had transferred Vanderbilt money across generations now came with a substantial cost. The Twombleys felt these pressures like all wealthy families. Their income remained substantial, but their after-tax income decreased. The cost of maintaining Florum didn't drop to match. Hamilton Twombly was aging. Born in 1849, he reached his 60s in the 1910s. Managing a Fonson 200-acre estate required energy and attention he no longer possessed. The day-to-day decisions, staffing problems, maintenance issues gradually became burdens rather than sources of pride. Florence remained active longer, continuing to host events and maintain their social calendar. But she too was approaching 60. The exhausting schedule of entertaining, the constant management of household operations, began to feel less rewarding. Their children were adults now with their own lives. Ruth married and moved away. Florence Jr. married as well. Hamilton Jr., and Alice pursued their own interests. None showed particular interest in eventually taking over Florum. The house had been built for their parents' generation. Its appeal didn't automatically transfer. The 1920s brought one final surge of extravagant spending among America's wealthy. The stock market soared. Prohibition created a culture of illegal speakeasies and wild parties. For those with money, the decade felt like a last celebration before reality intruded. But Hamilton Twombly didn't live to see it. He died on August 1st, 1910. He was 60 years old. The death wasn't unexpected. His health had been declining, but it marked the end of an era for Florum. The estate had been Hamilton's vision. Florence had supported it, certainly. But the ambition to build something that rivaled the greatest houses in America had been his. Florence inherited everything. She was 56 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and suddenly solely responsible for an estate that required constant attention and enormous expenditure. She maintained Florum for another 2 decades. The house continued to host events. Staff kept everything running. But the energy had changed. This was preservation, not celebration. The effort now went toward maintaining what existed, rather than expanding or improving. Florence died on February 10, 1952. She was 98 years old and had outlived her husband by 42 years. Her will divided the estate among her children, but none wanted to live there. The house was too large. The costs were impossible to justify. The lifestyle it represented had vanished decades earlier. The children faced a decision that heirs across America were confronting in the post-war years. What do you do with a mansion built for a world that no longer exists? Selling to a private buyer seemed unlikely. Who could afford the purchase price plus the operating costs? Demolition crossed their minds. The land alone was valuable. Subdivide the 1,200 acres into residential lots, and you could generate millions. But destroying a building this significant felt wrong, even if keeping it made no financial sense. They searched for institutional buyers. A school, perhaps. A corporation needing a headquarters. Some organization with the resources and need for enormous amounts of space. In 1958, they found their answer. Fairleigh Dickinson University was a young institution looking to expand. Founded in 1942 in Rutherford, New Jersey, the school had grown rapidly in the post-war years. Returning veterans using GI Bill benefits flooded colleges across America, and Fairleigh Dickinson needed more space to accommodate growing enrollment. The Twombly heirs approached the university with a proposal: purchase Florum and convert it into a campus. The buildings could house classrooms, administrative offices, and student facilities. The grounds could accommodate additional construction as the university expanded. For Fairleigh Dickinson, the opportunity was extraordinary. Acquiring 1,200 acres with existing buildings would have cost tens of millions on the open market. The Twombly family offered a substantial discount, effectively donating much of the property's value. In 1958, the deal closed. Fairleigh Dickinson purchased the Florum estate and began converting it into what would become the Florum campus. The transformation required extensive work. The mansion had been designed for private family use with elaborate formal spaces and hidden service areas. Converting it into functional campus buildings meant reconfiguring interiors, adding classroom facilities, and modernizing utilities that were decades out of date. The Great Hall became a gathering space for students. The library retained its function, though now filled with academic texts rather than first editions. Bedrooms were converted into offices for faculty and administrators. The ballroom hosted university events instead of society parties. The grounds underwent even more dramatic changes. New dormitories were constructed to house students. Academic buildings went up to provide modern classrooms and laboratories. Parking lots appeared where gardens had been sown. The formal landscape gradually gave way to the practical needs of a working campus. Some aspects of the original estate survived better than others. The main house's exterior remained largely intact. The architecture was too distinctive to alter significantly. McKim, Mead, and White's design still dominates the campus, providing an impressive backdrop for student life. Interior details were more vulnerable. Some of the finest woodwork was preserved. The entrance hall's oak paneling survived, as did the Great Hall's massive fireplace. But many rooms were stripped of decorative elements to create neutral spaces suitable for offices or classrooms. The elaborate plasterwork, the period light fixtures, the careful attention to detail that Twombly had demanded, much of it disappeared during renovations. The broader estate proved useful for university expansion. As enrollment grew, Fairleigh Dickinson built additional facilities across the property. The 1,200 acres provided room for growth that would have been impossible at a typical urban campus. The university could expand without the constant need to acquire adjacent properties. The irony was obvious. A house built to demonstrate the supremacy of private wealth became an educational institution serving middle-class students. The spaces designed for exclusive gatherings of America's elite now hosted lectures, student clubs, and graduation ceremonies. Florum had been transformed from a monument to excess into a genuinely useful facility serving the public good. But institutional ownership came with trade-offs. Universities prioritize function over aesthetics. Maintenance budgets focus on preventing problems rather than restoring historical features. As decades passed, Florum's condition declined in ways it never would have under private ownership. The main house remained structurally sound. The brick and stone construction ensured longevity, but details suffered. Windows needed repair. Roofs developed leaks. The interior spaces showed wear from constant use by thousands of students rather than careful preservation by domestic staff. By the 1990s, Fairleigh Dickinson recognized that the Florum mansion required serious restoration work. The building had historical significance beyond just the university. It represented one of the finest examples of McKim, Mead, and White's residential work. It embodied the Gilded Age's architectural ambition. Letting it deteriorate further would be a loss not just for the campus, but for American architectural heritage. The university launched restoration projects focused on the most significant spaces. The entrance hall received attention. Damaged woodwork was repaired or replicated. The Great Hall's fireplace was restored. Efforts were made to return these rooms closer to their original appearance, even while they continued to serve modern campus functions. These projects cost millions. Money that could have funded scholarships or academic programs went toward preserving historical architecture instead. The university justified the expense by arguing that the Florum mansion was part of what made their campus unique, that it attracted students and donors who valued the connection to history. Today, Florum campus serves approximately 3,000 students. The mansion houses administrative offices. Students walk through spaces where Vanderbilts once danced. They study in rooms where Hamilton Twombly entertained business titans and politicians. Most probably don't think much about the history beneath their feet. To them, it's just a building. The grounds still show traces of the original landscape design. Mature trees planted more than a century ago provide shade along walkways. The basic topography remains, though modified by campus needs. If you know what to look for, you can still sense the intentional shaping that made this place different from natural New Jersey woodland. The transformation of Florum from private estate to university campus represents one possible outcome for Gilded Age mansions. Not all were this fortunate. Many were demolished. Others decayed until they became unsalvageable. Some became museums, preserved behind velvet ropes but no longer lived in. Florum found a middle path, still used, still serving a purpose, but fundamentally changed from what its builders intended. Hamilton Twombly spent $2 million creating a perfect recreation of an English manor house in New Jersey. He succeeded in that goal. The house he built matched the finest country estates in England. But the world moved on. The fortunes that seemed permanent proved temporary. The lifestyle that felt essential became obsolete. And the monument he built outlasted its purpose by decades before finding a new one he never could have imagined. Understanding Florham requires understanding the peculiar economic moment that made it possible. The mansion was built in 1897, at the peak of what historians call the Gilded Age. That term, coined by Mark Twain, described the period from roughly 1870 to 1900, when American industrial expansion created unprecedented private wealth. The numbers were staggering. Between 1865 and 1900, the American economy grew faster than at any time in history. Railroads connected coast to coast. Steel production increased 20-fold. Oil, discovered in Pennsylvania in 1859, became a massive industry. Telegraph and telephone networks spread across the country. Corporations grew from small operations into national and international entities. A tiny percentage of Americans captured most of these gains. The men who controlled railroads, steel mills, oil refineries, and banks accumulated fortunes that dwarfed anything previous generations had known. Cornelius Vanderbilt's $105 million in 1877 was just the beginning. By 1900, John D. Rockefeller was worth over $900 million. Andrew Carnegie sold his steel company for $480 million in 1901. These weren't salaries earned through work. They were ownership stakes in industries that dominated the economy. This wealth concentration happened for specific reasons. Government regulation barely existed. Antitrust laws weren't enforced until Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. Labor had no legal protections. Workplace safety standards didn't exist. Unions were suppressed, often violently. Wealthy industrialists could pay workers as little as the market would bear while keeping all profits for themselves. Taxation was minimal. The federal government operated primarily on tariff revenues. There was no income tax until 1913. No estate tax. No capital gains tax. When wealthy individuals died, they could transfer their entire fortunes to heirs without government involvement. The result was dynastic wealth. The Vanderbilts, Astors, Morgans, and similar families maintained their positions across generations. Children inherited fortunes that allowed them to live without working. Grandchildren did the same. The money seemed permanent because nothing challenged its accumulation or transfer. This created a class of Americans who lived entirely differently from everyone else. While average workers earned perhaps $500 per year, wealthy families spent that much on a single dinner party. While most Americans lived in homes of a few rooms, the wealthy built 100-room mansions. The disconnect was absolute. Hamilton Twombley was part of this world through marriage. His wife's Vanderbilt inheritance provided the foundation, but his own approach to wealth reflected the era's values. He didn't create anything himself. He didn't build a business or innovate or take risks. He managed Florence's inheritance and spent it on maintaining their social position. That was considered legitimate occupation for a wealthy gentleman. Working in business, if you didn't need the money, was viewed as slightly vulgar. Florum represented the logical endpoint of these attitudes. If your wealth seemed unlimited and would face no serious taxation, why not build the largest, most elaborate house imaginable? Why consider operating costs when your investment income exceeded any foreseeable expense? Why worry about the future when your present seemed secure? The Gilded Age. Wealthy built dozens of houses like Florham. Newport, Rhode Island, filled with summer cottages that were actually massive mansions. The Breakers, Marble House, Rosecliff, all constructed during the same period by families from the same social circle. The Berkshires in Massachusetts attracted similar development. Shadowbrook, built for Anson Phelps Stokes, contained 100 rooms and was the largest private residence in America until Biltmore was completed. Long Island's Gold Coast became home to over 600 estates. Mansions lined the shore, each family trying to outdo their neighbors. The scale of construction during this period was extraordinary. In the 20 years from 1890 to 1910, America's wealthiest families built more large residential estates than had been constructed in the previous century combined. Florum was part of a wave. But waves break. The conditions that created Gilded Age fortunes began changing even before Florum was finished. Progressive reformers attacked monopolies. Labor movements demanded better treatment. Journalists exposed the cost of unregulated capitalism, the dangerous working conditions, the child labor, the environmental destruction. Public opinion shifted. The idea that wealthy families deserved unlimited wealth while others suffered began to seem less like natural order and more like exploitation. World War I shattered any remaining illusions that the old order would continue forever. The European aristocracy that American plutocrats had tried to emulate was destroyed. Kings were overthrown. Ancient estates were abandoned or converted to public use. The Russian Revolution showed what could happen when inequality became unbearable. American wealthy families paid attention. They began, slowly, to moderate their displays. The massive mansions built in the 1890s and 1900s were not replicated in the 1920s and 30s. Families still built large houses, but nothing approaching Florum's scale became standard. The economic rationale had changed, and so had the social acceptability of that level of excess. By the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s, large private estates were already viewed as relics. The crash of 1929 destroyed many fortunes entirely. Others survived, but were diminished. The era of building 100-room houses for single families was over. Nobody would attempt anything like Florum again. The houses that survived from that period became curiosities. Expensive to maintain, impractical to use, too historically significant to demolish without controversy. They lingered as physical reminders of an era when wealth had fewer constraints and less shame. Florum's story encapsulates this trajectory perfectly. Built at the peak, used for a generation, became unsustainable, found new purpose only by abandoning its original function. The mansion endures not because the Twombley vision succeeded, but because it failed in a way that allowed transformation rather than destruction. Today, students attend classes in rooms built to host balls. They cross lawns designed to impress visiting aristocrats. They likely don't think much about the fact that one family spent what would now be $75 million building a house just to prove they could. That world is gone. The wealth that created it still exists in different forms, concentrated differently, displayed differently. But nobody builds Florums anymore. The ambition remains. The wealth remains. What changed was the willingness to demonstrate that wealth through architectural excess. We prefer subtler symbols now. Private jets instead of private palaces. Exclusive clubs instead of personal estates. Yachts anchored out of sight instead of mansions visible to neighbors. The question that haunts Florum is the same one that haunts every monument to excess built during the Gilded Age. Was it worth it? Hamilton Twombly spent $2 million, a fortune equivalent to $75 million today, creating something that served its intended purpose for barely 20 years. The house was designed for a specific lifestyle that was already disappearing when construction began. By the time it was finished, the world was changing. Within one generation, that lifestyle was completely obsolete. From a pure economic standpoint, Florum was a catastrophic waste of resources. The money could have funded schools, hospitals, infrastructure that would have benefited thousands. Instead, it created 100 rooms that usually sat empty, maintained by dozens of servants for the convenience of one family who used them only part of the year. But economics don't capture the full story. Architecture matters. Craftsmanship matters. The preservation of beauty and skill has value even when divorced from practical utility. The stonemasons who carved Florum's details, the craftsmen who installed woodwork, the artisans who created plasterwork, all were practicing skills that might otherwise have been lost. Their work survives. Students today walk past architectural details that represent the absolute peak of turn-of-the-century craftsmanship. They may not notice, but the quality is there. The attention to detail endures. The refusal to cut corners or accept good enough when perfect was possible, that commitment created something that has lasted more than a century and will likely last several more. McKim, Mead, and White's design influence extends beyond the individual building. Florum helped establish the historicist approach that would dominate American architecture for decades. The idea that buildings could and should reference historical styles, that architecture could create emotional connections through familiar forms, that precedent mattered, these principles shaped countless buildings that followed. From another perspective, Florham represents a case study in how wealth corrupts judgment. The Twombleys didn't need a 100-room house. Nobody does. The decision to build on this scale reflected not practical requirements, but social competition. Other Vanderbilts were building large estates. The Twombleys needed to keep pace, or risk losing status within their own family and social circle. This arms race of conspicuous consumption benefited no one. Every dollar spent on Florum's gold leaf and imported stone was a dollar that couldn't fund something useful. The servants employed there might have done more valuable work elsewhere. The resources consumed, the land dedicated to one family's vanity, represented a misallocation on a grand scale. Yet we preserve these buildings. We celebrate them. When Fairleigh Dickinson spends millions restoring Florum's entrance hall, we applaud the commitment to heritage. We tour historic mansions as destinations, paying admission to walk through rooms we simultaneously acknowledge were built through exploitation. The contradiction is uncomfortable. We condemn the inequality that made these estates possible while enjoying the aesthetic result. We criticize the robber barons while photographing their architecture. We want to have it both ways: moral superiority over the past's excesses and appreciation for what those excesses produced. Perhaps the most honest assessment is simply this: Florum is what happens when wealth encounters ambition in an era without restraint. The Twombleys had the money, the desire, and the opportunity to build something remarkable. They did. The result outlived their time, outlived their family's interest in maintaining it, outlived the social structures that gave it meaning. But it didn't disappear. It transformed. The building found a new purpose that its creators never imagined and probably would have rejected. Hamilton Twombly built a monument to aristocratic privilege. He created spaces designed to exclude ordinary people and celebrate elite status. Today, those spaces serve education. Students from middle-class backgrounds, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the workers who might have once been relegated to Florum's service entrances, now walk freely through its halls. They use what Twombly built, but they've stripped it of its original meaning. The architecture remains. The intent behind it has been erased. There's justice in that transformation. The mansion that was meant to demonstrate the Twombly family's permanent position atop the social hierarchy now serves people from every background. The building designed to separate classes now brings them together. The monument to excess became an educational tool by accident. That might be the best possible outcome. Better than demolition, certainly. Better than conversion to another private use. Better even than preservation as a museum, where the building would be frozen in time, displayed but not truly used. Florum lives because it adapted. The students who attend classes there are writing a new chapter in the estate's history, one that Hamilton Twombly never anticipated, but that gives his creation ongoing relevance. When the last person who remembered Florum as a private residence dies, and eventually they all will, the mansion will exist only in its current form. The university campus will be its reality. The Gilded Age estate will be history. Future generations will visit and read plaques explaining what it once was, but they'll experience it only as what it has become. In the end, Hamilton Twombly got what he wanted and lost what he cared about most. He built a house that would impress anyone who saw it. Mission accomplished. The architecture succeeds on its own terms, but the social position it was meant to secure, the family legacy it was supposed to establish, the demonstration of Vanderbilt superiority it was intended to provide, all that disappeared. The building remains. The meaning has changed. That might be the real lesson of Florum. Architecture outlasts intent. Buildings survive the purposes they were built to serve. Mansions designed for private family use become campuses, museums, hotels, anything that can justify the cost of keeping them standing. The original vision doesn't matter as much as adaptability. Florum could have been demolished in 1958. The Twombly heirs could have sold to developers, subdivided the land, erased every trace of what Hamilton built. For a few years, it probably would have been more profitable, but they chose preservation through transformation instead. They let the building survive by letting its purpose die. That choice means that students today can experience architecture that represents the peak of Gilded Age ambition. They can walk through spaces designed when wealth had fewer constraints and less shame. They can see what Hamilton Twombly built when he had $2 million to spend, and the determination to create something that would announce his family's importance to anyone who cared to notice, Everyone noticed, for exactly as long as it mattered. Then the world moved on, and the mansion moved with it, into a future its builder never imagined and might not have recognized. The house that cost everything is still standing. It just doesn't cost quite as much anymore, and it's being used by people Hamilton Twombly never intended to invite through the front door. There's a lesson somewhere in that transformation, about permanence and change, about wealth and purpose, about buildings and the people who create them, about the distance between what we intend and what endures. Florum stands in Madison, New Jersey, still impressive, still beautiful, still serving a purpose, just not the one it was built for. And perhaps that's exactly as it should be.